please subscribe and share for more story. When her daughter told her to find somewhere else to fade away, Margaret Holloway did not argue. After 42 years of marriage and motherhood, obedience came naturally. She packed her life into 2 worn suitcases, careful and quiet, playing the role she had perfected, the compliant mother who never made things difficult. 3 days later, she sat in a deep leather chair in a downtown law office, realizing her late husband had been playing a long, invisible game of strategy. And now the endgame had begun. Only 8 weeks earlier, Margaret was 66, known simply as Richard Holloway's wife of 46 years and the mother of one accomplished but distant daughter, Lydia. When Richard died suddenly at 72, her world didn't shrink. It collapsed. The house echoed with grief and silence. Lydia arrived the same day, wrapped in black cashmere and efficiency. "Mom, this is too much for you," she said, squeezing Margaret's shoulder. "I'll handle everything." Margaret believed her. Lydia had always been decisive, Richard's pride and joy. When Lydia married Nathan Cole, a polished financial consultant, Richard welcomed him eagerly. Their 2 children became his obsession. Margaret stayed invisible, managing meals, holidays, and emotions, the quiet machinery behind the family image. After the funeral, Lydia's concern hardened. "You can't stay here alone," she insisted. "The stairs, the memories. It's not healthy." Margaret nodded through grief, ignoring the unease she felt. The brochures appeared next, Silver Ridge Residences, Autumn Glen Living, left casually on the table. "These places are wonderful," Nathan said smoothly. "No responsibilities." What he meant was no house. No inheritance. Then came the Tuesday afternoon. Margaret was still sleeping in the guest room when Lydia arrived with Nathan and 2 movers holding empty suitcases. "We've made a decision," Lydia said. Nathan's firm moved him to the city. "This house is perfect for us." Margaret stared. "This is my home." Lydia's smile vanished. "Dad left everything to me." "That's impossible," Margaret whispered. "Richard wouldn't do that." Lydia's patience snapped. "You never understood money. You were just the wife." The words hollowed her out. "I've been generous letting you stay," Lydia continued. "Now it's time to move on." Margaret asked where she was supposed to go. Lydia shrugged. "There's a senior complex on Pine Street. Affordable." Then came the final cruelty. "Find somewhere else to fade away. You're not useful anymore." Margaret packed silently, 2 suitcases and a box of photos. Nathan loaded the car without looking at her. "You'll enjoy the independence," he muttered. They dropped her at a cheap roadside motel and handed her an envelope. Inside was $180. The motel smelled of old carpet and despair. Thin walls carried shouting from next door. Margaret sat on the bed, stunned. In one afternoon, she had lost her home, her security, and her dignity. Then a memory surfaced. Richard had been meticulous about documents. Years earlier, he had walked her through his will line by line. She remembered it clearly, and this wasn't it. The next morning, she used the motel's unreliable Wi-Fi to find Richard's attorney, Harold Whitman. When she arrived, he looked startled. "I've been trying to reach you," he said. Margaret asked to see the will. He frowned. "Didn't Lydia give you your copy?" There was a reading. Her blood ran cold. "I was never told." In that moment, Margaret understood. This hadn't been an accident. It had been planned. Harold Whitman's expression changed as he opened the burgundy folder. "Margaret, Lydia did not inherit everything," he said carefully. Richard was very clear. He slid the document across the desk. Margaret recognized Richard's precise signature instantly. As Harold read aloud, her hands trembled. The house was hers. 70% of all financial assets were hers as well. Lydia was left a much smaller portion, held in trust, with strict conditions. "Your husband insisted," Harold added, "that Lydia's inheritance depended on her treating you with dignity after his death." Margaret whispered. "She threw me out. She gave me cash and sent me to a motel." Harold's face hardened. "Then she has already violated the trust." Margaret felt the room spin. "She showed me papers," she said. "Legal documents." Harold nodded grimly. Forgeries, most likely. Richard updated this will 5 months before his death. He was worried. He leaned closer. Margaret, what your daughter did may qualify as elder fraud. The words sounded unreal.
Fraud. Crime.
What happens now? Margaret asked. Harold didn't hesitate. Now we involve the authorities and we reclaim what is legally yours. For the first time since Richard's death, Margaret felt something unfamiliar rise in her chest, not grief, but strength. By mid-afternoon, accounts were frozen and banks alerted. A financial crimes investigator named Detective Alvarez arrived, sharp-eyed and direct. This wasn't impulsive, she said, reviewing the fake documents. It was planned. Margaret's phone rang at exactly 4:12 p.m. Lydia's name flashed on the screen. Mom, where are you? Lydia snapped. All the accounts are locked. Margaret inhaled slowly. I'm at Harold Whitman's office. The lawyer you said handled everything. Silence followed. Then Lydia's voice softened. I was protecting you. You don't understand money. Margaret replied calmly. I understand lies. That trust you were counting on? Margaret continued. It's gone. You broke the condition. Lydia's voice cracked. That's impossible. Margaret glanced at Detective Alvarez. You can explain forgery to her, she said. Panic replaced arrogance. Mom, please. We can talk. Margaret's voice hardened. You told me to fade away. I chose not to. The line went dead. That evening, Lydia and Nathan were arrested separately, Lydia at a luxury restaurant, Nathan at his downtown office. Margaret slept that night for the first time without nightmares. The next morning, Margaret returned to her house with police present. Designer clothes littered the bedroom. She packed them into black bags and left them by the door. The house felt different, quieter, but finally hers. 2 days later, Lydia appeared on the porch, pale and frantic. Mom, I made a mistake, she cried. Margaret blocked the doorway. You didn't make a mistake, she said evenly. You made a choice. Lydia whispered, I'm still your daughter. Margaret met her eyes. Then you should have acted like it. She closed the door gently, not in anger, but in finality. The following morning brought another visitor. Nathan's mother, Evelyn Cole, arrived without calling. She stood on the porch in pearls and tailored wool, eyes cold with appraisal. Let's be practical, she said once seated. I'm prepared to offer you $6 million to drop the charges. Margaret didn't react. Evelyn leaned forward. Dragging this out will destroy families. You don't need that kind of money anyway. Margaret studied her calmly. My daughter said something similar, she replied. Evelyn's lips tightened. You're making enemies you don't understand. Margaret smiled faintly. I've lived with one for decades. That threat lingered. Instead of retreating, Margaret hired a private investigator, Rachel Monroe, a precise woman with sharp eyes. Together, they reviewed Richard's files in his study, now Margaret's study. What they uncovered turned Margaret's stomach. Beneath Richard's legitimate consulting business were layers of illegal transactions. Money laundering. Shell companies. Richard had not been who she thought he was. Worse, Lydia and Nathan had known. This was their leverage. Lydia called that night. We can make this go away, she said sweetly. You keep the house and $5 million. The rest disappears. Everyone walks free. Margaret hung up without answering. Instead, Margaret called federal authorities. She sat across from Agent Collins, steady despite shaking hands, and told her everything, the forgeries, the blackmail, the hidden crimes. When she finished, the agent studied her carefully. Would you be willing to cooperate? She asked. Margaret nodded. I'm done protecting people who never protected me. That evening, Lydia and Nathan came to the house, confident and smug. They explained their scheme in detail, unaware of the wire beneath Margaret's blouse. You'll sign the agreement, Nathan said. Margaret nodded quietly. The front door opened mid-sentence. Agents flooded the room. Lydia Hale and Nathan Cole, Agent Collins announced, you're under arrest for conspiracy, fraud, elder abuse, and attempted extortion. Lydia turned on Margaret, screaming, How could you do this to your own family? Margaret answered softly. The same way you did. Only legally. They were led away in handcuffs. The house fell silent again, but this time it felt clean. 2 days later, Agent Collins returned with a final truth. Richard had been an informant, not a criminal mastermind. The money was legitimate, payment for years of undercover cooperation. Margaret sank into a chair, stunned. He was protecting me, she whispered. He always was, the agent replied. Months later, Margaret stood in her renovated kitchen, sunlight pouring in. She had founded the Holloway Trust for Elder Justice, funding legal aid for seniors betrayed by family. Her life hadn't ended. It had finally begun. The greatest inheritance wasn't the money. It was herself. News of the arrest spread quickly. Friends who had gone silent for weeks suddenly called, their voices filled with forced concern. Margaret kept conversations brief. She was done explaining herself. Reporters tried to reach her. She declined every request. Healing, she realized, required privacy. Each morning, she walked through the house slowly, reclaiming rooms she had once tiptoed around. The guest room became a reading space. The dining room table, once used to host polite lies, now held stacks of documents and plans for the future. Margaret no longer moved carefully. She moved deliberately. Court proceedings followed. Lydia avoided Margaret's eyes during hearings, her confidence replaced by resentment and fear. Nathan looked smaller, stripped of charm. When asked to testify, Margaret spoke clearly and without theatrics. I trusted my daughter, she said simply. She used that trust as a weapon. The courtroom stayed silent. No one questioned her credibility. The truth no longer needed defending. When the verdicts came down, Margaret felt no triumph, only finality. After the trials, Margaret sold several properties she had never known existed. She downsized not out of loss, but choice. She renovated the house to suit herself, not a marriage that no longer defined her. She took piano lessons, something Richard had once discouraged as impractical. She traveled alone for the first time in her life. Each decision felt radical simply because it was hers. Letters arrived from strangers, elderly parents, widows, men and women betrayed quietly by family. Margaret answered everyone. She funded legal clinics, support lines, safe housing. You're brave, one woman wrote. Margaret shook her head. I was patient, she replied. There's a difference. Strength, she learned, often came disguised as endurance. On her 67th birthday, Margaret sat on the back porch at sunset, tea cooling beside her. The house was quiet, peaceful. She thought of the woman who had once packed her life into 2 suitcases and been told to fade away. That woman no longer existed. Margaret smiled softly. She hadn't survived to disappear. She had survived to be seen, and she had no intention of ever shrinking again. Margaret eventually moved her bedroom into what had once been Richard's study. She liked waking up surrounded by books instead of memories that no longer served her. The heavy desk became her own, polished and cleared of secrets. Every morning, she sat there with coffee and sunlight and reminded herself that peace was not passive. It was built, chosen, defended. She stopped apologizing for taking up space, even in her own thoughts. Lydia wrote from prison twice. The first letter was angry, full of blame and self-pity. Margaret didn't respond. The second arrived months later, shorter, quieter, edged with regret. I don't know who I am without the things I wanted, Lydia wrote. Margaret folded the letter and placed it in a drawer. Forgiveness, she understood now, did not require access. Nathan's family settled privately. Lawyers handled it. Margaret refused to attend meetings meant to pressure her into compassion she no longer owed. I'm not cruel, she told Harold Whitman. I'm finished. He nodded, understanding. There was relief in finality, in choosing not to reopen wounds disguised as reconciliation. The Holloway Trust grew quickly. Volunteers called her formidable. Survivors called her safe. Margaret corrected them gently. I'm not strong, she said. I'm honest. She spoke at small gatherings, never grand stages. Her voice didn't need amplification anymore. People leaned in when she spoke. One afternoon, Mrs. Alden from the assisted living center, whom Margaret had once met briefly during outreach, visited for tea. They laughed over biscuits and stories of lives interrupted and reclaimed. "Funny how they think quiet women are harmless," Mrs. Alden said. Margaret smiled. "That's usually their last mistake." Years later, Margaret donated the house to the trust, turning it into a legal refuge for seniors. She moved into a sunlit apartment overlooking a park, modest and entirely hers. No one knew her as someone's wife or someone's mother there. She was simply Margaret. On her 70th birthday, Margaret locked her door gently and smiled. Once, she had been told to fade away. Instead, she had learned how to stand fully in her own life. The greatest inheritance was never the money, the house, or the justice. It was the moment she stopped shrinking and understood she never had to be small again. Thanks for watching. If you value stories of respect, dignity, and justice, please subscribe. It means more than you know, and it lets me keep sharing the lessons life has carved into me.